So we're going to be here tonight sharing a little bit more about Native Nations 101. And before we really dive into that as a topic, we just kind of like to share a little bit more about who we are as an organization, who we are here tonight as presenters, before really diving into that content. So I will get us started. And if you haven't heard of Native Governance Center before, we are a Native-led nonprofit, and we're really dedicated to assisting Native nations in strengthening their governance systems and their capacity to exercise their sovereignty. And right now, we have a service region that includes 23 Native nations. They're pictured here, and they share geography with Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And then our programming has really grown. So some of it is also offered nationwide now as well. We have a staff of 10, so I like to describe us as small but mighty. And we have really seen a demand for our services and these different program areas grow over the years. So we're adding a few new positions as well this year. So we're seeing a lot of really exciting growth, a lot of interest in learning more about Native communities, both past and present. And we're really excited to help kind of meet that need in various ways. And so at Native Governance Center, we have these four main program areas that we focus on. The first being community engagement. That is the program area that Lauren and I work under. That's how we're here tonight. So we get to work with different external organizations and do kind of customized trainings. We also provide free educational videos, guides, and workshops throughout the year. And we have a really great free resources library online that you can check out. And then for leadership development, that is where we work kind of grassroots with different Native change makers across our region. And we have a leadership cohort that we do annually called the Native Nation Rebuilders. And then finally, in tribal governance support and tribal finance, that is where our staff is working directly with Native nations and really providing customized support in those different areas. So it looks very different depending on what that Native nation might need. And so, yeah, just a lot of exciting work happening at NGC. And we are really, again, happy to be here with you all tonight and just share some more information. So I'm going to start us off with our presenter introductions. So, Buju, Kriros, and Dujnakas. Hello, my name is Kriros. I am a member of the Chippewa Cree tribe, which is located out in Rocky Boy, Montana. But currently, I'm living in my partner's hometown, which is Casa Grande, Arizona, which is about an hour south of Phoenix. It is O'odham and Peeposh lands. I work at NGC as a program coordinator for movement building, and I've been in the role for almost 2 years now, so it's pretty amazing. And I really love our work at NGC and what we get to do because we just get to share stories, kind of build up educational and awareness, and help folks kind of discover how they can be good allies and uplift Native nations. And I will go ahead and pass things over to Lauren.
Thanks, Cree. Hey, everybody. My name is Lauren Kramer. I'm the External and Donor Relations Officer at Native Governance Center. I'm calling in from Dakota Land in Minneapolis today, so very close to all of you. Pretty familiar with the area you're calling in from. And I just love this work and the opportunity to work with Cree on community engagement because it's just so enjoyable to build new relationships and hear about why all of you are interested in the mission of our organization and the work that we do. And I feel like I always get to learn something new every time, which is really enjoyable. So I'm going to kind of talk about what we can expect. I'm also going to say I want to keep this exciting and fun and interactive because it's 6 o'clock on a Thursday night. So hopefully all of us can bond a little bit over Zoom and get through the content while feeling engaged and like we're able to remember something at the end of the call. I think that's always a win. So what we're going to do today is really just give you the basics. I think these basics are so important because so many of us didn't learn this information in school or previously in community. And so we kind of put together this presentation to really provide a great starting point and a grounding point to get to know Native nations. So what are their priorities? how can, all of us support them in achieving those priorities? And how can we really understand key aspects of what they do? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We've sorted it into a variety of topics. We've sourced this information from our staff who work directly with Native nations, which is always really rewarding for us to kind of hear about their experiences on the ground working with tribal leaders. So you'll find that kind of infused throughout the presentation. As I said, we're going to cover some key concepts. Some of them are tribal sovereignty, tribal governance. What does that all mean? What are some of the challenges and realities that we might see tribal leaders facing? And, especially in the last few years, these challenges have only grown. So we'll touch on some of those. And then we're going to talk about how all of this fits in to a bigger overall movement that's really kind of happening nationwide, internationally, and what all of us can do to really support Native nations as they work toward thriving for 7 generations. We always like to customize our content too. We were telling Elsa this helps us learn about new stories and Native nations that we might not interact with as much. And we heard that a large percentage of students in the White Bear Lake area are Ho-Chunk. And so we've included some case studies highlighting Ho-Chunk Nation and also just a lot of case studies from Minnesota Makoche more broadly. So look for those in the presentation. Some of these might be things that you've heard about in the news recently. So stay tuned. And as I mentioned, we haven't really all probably learned this before. We take that into account and try to be as accessible as possible with the content. So you will see things presented at a beginner level, just trying to make sure that we're all on the same page with opportunities to go a little bit deeper and provide some chances for some more challenging content. And we ask that if you have a question, that's amazing. We love interactivity and being able to talk with all of you. Ideally, if you could hold the question till the end so we can just kind of go into a Q&A period, that'd be great. But if it's something really urgent, feel free to ask. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat if it helps you remember the question at the end. We will go through questions both in the chat and, questions that folks kind of ask us live. And we've allotted a generous 30 minutes for questions just because we know this is a lot of information all at once. It's a lot of new information. So bring your questions. We'd love to talk with you. Take advantage of this opportunity to really ask us anything. So I think that's kind of everything for expectations. I'm going to just touch on the live polling once more. So we do this not to quiz you, not to put you on the spot or make you feel bad, but to get you really kind of interacting with each other and our content. It's just kind of like a fun poll online where you can, enter in your thoughts on something you've heard or something you think you might know. So if you want to participate in that, you can follow the URL on the screen, menti.com. And then we're just going to have you put in that code 35661541. And we're going to test it out right now, actually. And if you're not ready, no worries. We will return to this throughout the presentation. But we're just curious what kind of work you're doing in your current role. And that we could use work very broadly here. It could be like community work, work with your family, professional work. Just kind of what are you currently engaged in right now? Okay, worked in higher ed. Thank you so much for all of your years serving in higher ed. That's so important. Okay, systems analyst, marketing and events. Oh, that sounds so fun. Love it. We have such a diverse skill set here. This is great. I feel like all of us will have ways to contribute something to the conversation. Let's see. Okay, manufacturers representative. Love it. This is great. I'm just like so glad that all of you are here interested in this topic, and I hope that we can inspire you to find ways to apply this to your work, whatever that may be. Tree farming, great. I have such appreciation for anyone engaged in farming after a failed summer stint on a farm, so thank you. Well, this is great, everybody. I will turn it back over to our PowerPoint now. And again, We love to see these answers. I don't want to cut anyone off. There will be so many more chances to continue to share things. But I'm going to kind of ground everybody in a concept that's very fundamental to our work, which is tribal sovereignty. And I don't think I even knew how to spell the word sovereignty until I was well into college. So we very much understand if this is something that's new to you, but we really think it's important for understanding how Native nations operate, and what it really means for them. So we have put together a short video on this topic. It's one of our most popular videos. And we're going to show that, and then I will kind of do a quick recap, and we'll ask if anybody has questions on that before we go into the rest of our presentation.
Tribal sovereignty. It's a phrase you've likely heard before, but what does it really mean? Sovereignty is the natural right of a people to govern themselves. Sovereignty means that tribes operate as independent nations within a nation. And did you know that there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the United States? All of these tribes have their own constitutions, laws, elections, and infrastructure designed to meet their people's needs. Their rights, lands, assets, and resources are their own. This is similar to how the United States government exercises sovereignty on behalf of its citizens. Tribal nations have been sovereign since time immemorial. Sovereignty is not granted, but rather it is recognized. The federal government recognizes tribe sovereignty through treaties. In order to make a treaty, two sovereign nations must come together, recognize each other's right to govern their own people, and create an agreement. With or without the United States, tribal nations are sovereign. But if you need more proof, the United States Constitution, in addition to hundreds of treaties and Supreme Court cases, has repeatedly affirmed tribes' right to govern themselves. Remember, tribal nations have always been and will always be sovereign. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The United States government's frequent violations of its treaty obligations do not change that. Now that we understand what sovereignty is, why is sovereignty important? Sovereignty matters because sovereign nations know best what their people need. Tribal governments make vital decisions for their people related to healthcare, education, and economic development, among others. When Native nations make their own decisions, they are more likely to thrive. Strong, sovereign tribal governments foster strong tribal economies and nations. We honor and affirm tribal sovereignty. To learn more about why sovereignty matters, visit nativegov.org or treatiesmatter.org.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cree, for getting that video queued up for us. I always, just really appreciate that straightforward recap of the different elements of sovereignty. I think, it's really what guarantees Native nations' right to design and control their own futures. And we're hearing more and more about that in the news as time goes on. I just want to kind of open it up to everybody to see if there are any questions on what was covered in that video. We're going to keep talking about sovereignty and real life applications. So you might continue to learn more. Cree's actually going to do that after this, talk about some case studies, but does anyone have any questions on what they just heard? And you can also save a question till the end too, if that feels better. Okay, well, great. I love that it's so straightforward. And if you think of it later, like I said, we'll have more time. Um, so I want to turn back to Mentimeter. Before we share some examples that we've seen in the news, we want to know what you've been hearing. So have you seen sovereignty mentioned in the news or maybe in some of the work that you do that we heard about in the previous question? If you have, if you could share what that issue area is with us, that would be great. If you're like, I just learned about sovereignty today. I have no clue if I've seen it in the news. That's totally fine. You can just feel free to write not sure. That's also a great answer. Okay, we have somebody who's seen it for many years. Love it. Somebody who's seen news about family rights. Great. We're actually going to touch on that in our next set of examples. Okay, we have just like a lot of astute people here who have seen this in the news. Land rights. Yes, tribal election posters. Okay, I think we even have one of those on a future slide in this presentation. They're very noticeable and really fun actually to see. Okay, and it looks like we have a great question before we move on from Carol in the chat. Um, I'll touch on that now just because it's related to the video. But do the 574 nations work with each other or only deal with their own communities? That's actually a great question. There are so many ways that nations partner with each other and collaborate. We can give some more concrete examples at the end of the presentation, but nations are consistently collaborating with other Native nations and even local governments, for example, to really get things done that they couldn't otherwise do. We actually just had an event today, actually, that we can put the link in the chat for on partnering with Native nations. And it was not only like, how can local governments, businesses, individuals partner with nations, but what are some examples of things that nations are doing to partner with other entities? So that's a great question. Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody who responded. I'm going to turn it over to Cree.
Thank you, Lauren. And I just put that recording in the chat if anybody does want to check it out. And so we do want to share some additional examples. I love the ones that came through in Mentimeter. Those are great. And these are going to be just a bit more specific on when tribal sovereignty has been both challenged and flexed. And flexed is kind of a term that we like to use a lot around when Native nations really uphold their tribal sovereignty, but it can look very different depending on the Native nation. Oops, apologies there. Okay. And so last year, as someone put in the Mentimeter, there was a lot happening around the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. So in summer 2023, the Supreme Court actually ruled on a case that was challenging the Indian Child Welfare Act, also known as ICWA. And ICWA was something that was originally passed in 1978 to combat a history of forced removal of and family separation in the United States. And it was set up to hopefully prevent the removal of Native children from their families, communities, and ultimately from their cultures. So experts really saw this case happening last summer as a threat to tribal sovereignty in general, in addition to a threat to more specific Native nations. And so this is actually a great example of a bunch of different Native nations partnering, getting together to really rally around ICWA, supporting this case, and really pushing for more protections for Native children. And so families in this case, unfortunately, saw ICWA as a threat because they felt that a decision was being made purely based on their race. This is where it's tricky because they didn't really understand that being Native American is both a racial and political identifier. And so our children oftentimes have very different needs. And so, although in this case, ICWA was upheld and it was really great news, many states took this as maybe a signal to do more for Native children in their area and built in ICWA level protections at that state level so that they could better protect children in the future, regardless of what maybe will happen at the federal level for ICWA if it is challenged in the future. And so that was a really interesting example to me because it's both an example of the challenge and the flex. As I mentioned, a lot of Native nations really rallied around that case. We had Native activists and individuals really doing a lot of education. And so I was glad to see that come up in the Mentimeter because I think that was a case that really, really got out there into the mainstream for a lot of folks. And then another example that we wanted to share of a Native nation really flexing their sovereignty is an example more specific to Minnesota Makoche or Minnesota, and that is about the Prairie Island Indian community. And so the Prairie Island Indian community, they are a Native nation that shares geography with Minnesota, and they have ancestral lands along the banks of the Mississippi River. In 1934, the US government recognized a 534-acre reservation for the nation, but just 4 years later, the Army Corps of Engineers approved Lock and Dam number 3, which then flooded the reservation and reduced its size to just around 300 livable acres of land. And further adding insult to injury, after that, the federal government then approved and licensed a nuclear power plant just 700 yards from the reservation. So, literally, right next to their community is this huge nuclear power plant. The plant began operation in 1973. The structure is still around today. And despite Prairie Island's objections, nearly 1,000 pounds or tons, excuse me, of highly toxic spent nuclear fuel is stored next to their reservation. So this has very real impacts on their community, both past and present. And in response to these challenges, Prairie Island decided to flex their sovereignty by looking for and acquiring additional land. And now they're working on putting that land into trust. So they purchased over 1,000 acres of land, about 35 miles south of their current reservation land. And they've received support from local officials to go ahead and put that into trust status. And so their sovereignty allows them to work at that government to government level with Congress to make that trust land happen. And Prairie Island Indian community is really looking out for those future 7 generations with this land, and they are hoping to use it for housing and other initiatives related to creating a vibrant future for their community. And so a question that we get a lot when we share these examples of like strong tribal sovereignty is how can Native and non-Native people help protect and strengthen sovereignty? And that's a tough question. We're going to share some examples, but I definitely encourage you, based on your own identity and role, to look for additional opportunities later on. But a really easy one for many of us is voting. So, in addition to voting in local and national elections, Native people can also get involved with and vote in their own nation's elections. So, they might support community sovereignty by carrying on and voting. They might practice a traditional activity or craft. They might be working on revitalizing their language along with uplifting and supporting movements for change outside of their nation as well. So maybe they are supporting something like ICWA, which isn't specific to a certain nation, but rather a larger cause that many of us really care deeply about. And then non-Native folks have an opportunity to support movements for change as well. So look out for movements for change led by Indigenous communities or Native-led organizations that you can support. They can also support sovereignty through simple actions that include using appropriate language, maybe learning more about the stolen land that they occupy, getting involved in Native community events that are open to the public, and so much more. And one example that we really like to share, because it's relevant to so many of our roles and the work that we do, is prioritizing data sharing. So if you are in a role that collects any sort of data around Native communities or Native individuals, look for how you can prioritize data sharing with tribal governments. If you're providing services to citizens of Native nations, consider how that nation might want or need access to the information that you're collecting, and if there's any possible potential for you all to partner on it. You also want to consider how you're using data about tribal citizens, because a lot of times this is maybe sensitive data that we're collecting. And so a great example that we like to share out is shared with us actually from our friends at Wilder Research. And every 3 years, they work to conduct the Minnesota Homeless Study, and they do that in partnership with 6 of the Ojibwe nations that share geography with Minnesota. So they work with those nations to get the most accurate data about their community. They actually go to that community and conduct different interviews with folks. And Native nations have full access and say over their community's data and how it ends up being used. So when Wilder shares out their full report to the public, they actually remove any individual nation data to protect the privacy of those tribal citizens and of that community. Especially when it comes to data, that's something important to keep in mind because some of our communities are very small. So although you might think it's anonymous enough to remove a name or something like that, you might also want to take it a step further when it comes to those data protections. And so those were just some quick general examples. But as you're kind of considering your own identity, your own role, and maybe what you have access to, do you have ideas on how you can support Native nations or sovereignty? And I'm going to turn it over to Mentimeter. So if you have ideas on how you can support Native nations or sovereignty in your work or personally, you can share those here. And as always, if you're not sure or you are maybe like me and need some time to reflect and gather your thoughts, you can always put down not sure as well. But we will see if folks have any ideas yet for how they can support sovereignty. Absolutely. So this first response says learning more about Native sovereignty and how it works is a great start. Absolutely agree with that. And hopefully it's something you not only feel comfortable learning more about, but also sharing that information. That's something we hear a lot from attendees is just the value of the information they've received and how they want to go out and spread it to their own network or their own community. And as you're kind of thinking about how you can support Native nations, I think a lot of times it's important to kind of reflect on your own individual identity. So maybe what kind of work you're doing, what you have access to, maybe if there's any overlap between or areas where you can provide solidarity with Native community. I think those are always really wonderful opportunities to look out for. And then for this next portion, we are really going to dive into a little bit more technical information on how tribal governance work. And we're going to start off by showing a pretty quick video. It's short, like the one a little bit before. And so let me get that going for us here.
There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations that share geography with the United States of America. Did you know that each of those nations has its own unique system of government? A tribe's sovereignty allows them to decide for themselves how to govern their nations. Tribes have their own constitutions, which outline how their governments work and how they work with the U.S. federal government. Some tribal constitutions provide for 3 branches of government. Others create councils made up of all eligible adult tribal citizens. no two tribal governments are the same. We know that all tribal governments are unique, but all tribal governments create and enforce laws. They all have the ability to tax their citizens and non-citizens living within their borders. Tribal governments serve both their citizens and non-citizens, just like other governments do. For example, many tribal governments have their own police departments, court systems, and first responder services. Tribal governments also meet critical needs in their communities by managing natural resources and providing healthcare and education. In order to maximize the value of the services they provide, tribal governments work with local, state, federal, and other tribal governments. And tribal governments innovate. From installing solar panels to connecting area homes with high-speed internet, tribal governments oftentimes lead the way in their local communities. The more tribes govern themselves, the more likely they are to prosper. That's because tribes know best what their citizens need.
And so that's a great little video. It really just provides you with the basics. But before we kind of dive in and talk a little bit more in depth about these government structures and about kind of different systems that we see today, does anyone have any questions about that video content or just about tribal governments more generally? All right. And so we are going to share just some additional examples based on what that video brought up. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is how tribal governments often have these small budgets, as it shared in the video, given their population and land base size, but this fosters a lot of innovation within our communities. And so we want to talk about some of the innovative things that tribal governments are doing. This is not at all an exhaustive list. It's just a couple examples from our region. But one of the things that we found was the Ho Chunk language app. And that's where the Ho Chunk Nation is partnering with the Language Conservancy to create a new app that would teach the Ho Chunk language. And once complete, the app would include 40 different language units for learners to go in and learn from. And this is really needed in Ho Chunk Nation, but also a lot of other Native nations because of the small amount of our fluent language speakers left. So there are actually fewer than 40 fluent Ho Chunk speakers left. And tribal leaders hope that their efforts to create this app, along with an online dictionary, will help revive the language and make it accessible to a whole new generation of learners. And they did some really intentional work where they paired younger voices with elders to record lessons for the app. And that's actually pretty unique. I've tried to learn Ojibwe a few times, and oftentimes it is only elders speaking, which is wonderful. But this would be encouraging younger people to learn their language as well, just hearing those younger voices in the app. And so Ho Chunk Nation plans to release their app sometime in 2024, but the dictionary is actually online and available now. So this is something that is really cool, and we're just seeing more and more language revitalization projects in different Native nations. Um, and so another really cool initiative that we're seeing in the region is from White Earth Nation, and they have this Indigenous Parent Leadership Initiative class. And so they designed a 21-week leadership journey for Indigenous parents. And the curriculum is really focused on leadership, self-perception, social change, and then Indigenous language and culture. So it's grounding it back in that culture, and it's to help Indigenous parents who are struggling with trauma to heal. And White Earth Nation took curriculum from the National Parent Leadership Institute, indigenized it, and really had it fit in their culture and something that would resonate with their citizens. And again, something unique about this is that they provide participants with a stipend. It's $500 upon graduation, and they use that to carry out a community project. And like other governments, we've touched on this, tribal governments build partnerships with different state governments, city and council governments, federal government, obviously, but also businesses and community organizations. And so there are a lot of cool examples, especially recently popping up, that focus on these partnerships and what they are really achieving within these different communities. And so a few examples that we wanted to share from Minnesota Makoche or Minnesota is Grand Portage State Park. The Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa actually co-manages the state park with the state of Minnesota. And in addition to just gorgeous natural beauty, the state park features interpretive displays with Ojibwe language created by tribal citizens. So that's really cool. And then the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community actually had funding and support for Native educational programming within the Three Rivers Park District. They donated $80,000 to the Park District for the development of new programming at Lowry Hill Nature Center, including an interpretive trail. So again, more really visual awareness when you're out and about in these spaces. And this is a really cool, mutually beneficial partnership because it's advancing the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community's goals around narrative change and educating more people about understanding Native nations in Minnesota. And it's also helping Lowry Hill be more responsive to the local community and provide a really high quality educational experience to park visitors coming in. Another cool example from the Ho-Chunk Nation is that they partnered with the University of Wisconsin-Madison to really infuse cultural knowledge into their Master Naturalist program. So the Ho-Chunk Natural Resources Department volunteered to lead training in 2023. Spots filled up almost instantly after they opened, which just shows the need and desire for those sorts of trainings. And one day a month over a 6 month period, the group met at sites significant to the Ho-Chunk Nation, from La Crosse to Madison and really everywhere in between. And participants were able to learn directly from Ho-Chunk tribal members. And they also were able to learn just a bit more about the history of the land and about the traditional ecological knowledge. And this is something that the University of Wisconsin considers a huge success for a pilot program and something that they continue to hopefully partner on for future cohorts, which would be really, really cool. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks. Yeah, hopefully all of this just inspires everyone to get out there and kind of see these enterprises in person. I feel like we're hearing about new innovative things happening almost every day. So be on the lookout. Nations are really kind of doing cool things everywhere and in places you might not expect. So I'm going to turn now and talk about something that's pretty timely, which is elections, given that we're coming into election season here. And I just want to get a pulse check here. Do you all know anything about tribal elections? Where are you at on that topic? So we're going to go back to Mentimeter and just check in. And again, if you don't know anything, just let us know. We're happy to report out that answer because I'm guessing other folks feel the same. But we will see where people are, and then I will kind of give an overview of tribal leaders and tribal elections. Okay, somebody knows nothing. Perfect. That's actually great because then this is super needed information. Not yet. Love it. Okay. That they happen. Yes. Okay. Very fair. Anybody else? Okay. Not sure how they're similar and different. Great. We're going to talk about that. Thanks everybody for being so responsive on this too. It kind of just creates a little bit more community behind the computer screen for sure. Okay, eager learners, love it. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of dive into some elections 101 information about Native nations. We've talked about, what they're up to, but like who are the people behind all of these cool initiatives happening? Like how are they making this movement happen? So the majority of Native nations, they host their own regularly scheduled elections to determine who is going to create these laws, represent their citizens. And this has been a common thread throughout the presentation. You've heard it again and again, but every nation is unique. So election processes are going to look really different between nations. They're not going to look the same. So if you know what happens in one nation, unfortunately, you got to learn about all of the rest of them. And constitutions really lay the foundation for these processes, how the elections work, what the different structures are. So if you really want to get deep into this, you can look for a nation's constitution and read all about their election processes there. But another thing that really varies between nations is political term limits. So some nations have 2-year terms, some have 4-year terms, some have elections that take place in the summer, some take place in the fall, and some are even the same or similar to elections for non-tribal governments. And you wouldn't believe how complicated this is to track for all of the nations that we serve. We actually at one point thought, oh, let's put this all in our database and try to kind of keep track of when all these elections are happening. And that got a little bit chaotic. So if you're wondering when they are, it's best to kind of just go to that nation directly and kind of look at their materials. So another thing that really varies between Native nations is the number of elected positions that they have. So in our region, which is Minnesota and the Dakotas, um, really nations elected leaders can range anywhere from 3 to 24, which is a huge range. And the elected positions have titles that range from tribal chair to secretary, treasurer, and then sometimes they get more specific to refer to maybe a particular district within that nation. So kind of be on the lookout for that. Know that some nations have a very large group of folks who are kind of running their governments, and others it's much smaller. I wanted to call out these tribal election signs here, just to go back to somebody who mentioned seeing them in the Mentimeter. This is just one photo. I wish we could show many more because there are some great signs out there, and you might see them around, especially if you're driving around greater Minnesota. In terms of who is eligible for tribal elections, it really varies too. Some nations require that citizens reside on the reservation to be eligible. Other times nations say, if you're enrolled and you're a citizen and you're living anywhere in the world, you can vote. When we look at results of elections, sometimes, you find that there's some controversy around, oh, this person voted and they should not have voted. They didn't meet the residency requirement. So you might see that come up in the news or in reports on elections. But again, the most important takeaway is all of these different sets of criteria are very diverse and always different. We wanted to kind of talk about, what could it look like if you're running for office? Like what might a candidate find in terms of how to be eligible? I'm sure we've heard about, what candidates running for state office have to do, but what would someone running for their tribal government do? So from a nation in our region, this nation requires that you have to be 25 years of age. You have to be a resident of the reservation for 1 year before the election. And then to get on the ballot, you have to get a petition signed by 10 legal voters. And then you have to get nominated at the district meeting. You have to pass a background check and you have to pay a filing fee. Once you've done that, this nation has their primary election in August and then a general election in November. So that's just kind of like an inside look at what somebody might encounter. But I just really think it's important for, even non-Native folks to understand how tribal elections work, because it can just really help us be better relatives toward Native communities and really kind of support these structures that are in place. And, when you understand how nations govern, it can just be a lot easier to meaningfully advocate for sovereignty and really build these good relationships with Native people and nations. We, a few years ago, put out an article about tribal elections. We can paste that in the chat in case you want to learn more. But yeah, just be on the lookout, especially as we kind of roll into election season. You might find that you're seeing more about tribal elections than you did in the past, now that you're aware. And I'm going to switch to possibly a more exciting topic, some of the day-to-day realities and challenges that tribal leaders face when they're serving. And you might be able to just kind of take a guess at what some of these could be based on what you've heard from us. But we're going to go to Mentimeter and see if you have any ideas. So given everything you've heard, what might be some of the biggest challenges leaders might encounter when serving their nations? And again, the not sure folks, we see you, we appreciate you. Put that in the Menti if that feels good. Otherwise, we will just, be cool with whoever answers. And if nobody wants to answer, that's okay too. We're actually just going to talk about it right away. Oh, we got somebody. Okay. Meeting expectations. Yes. Oh yes, working with surrounding communities. That can be a challenge, and we will talk about that. Dealing with current issues. Yep. And yes, a wide variety of needs. And there's so many parallels to, what leaders face in all types of governments. But then there are some that are really kind of specific to Native nations. So, as you know, Cree kind of mentioned this in the beginning. We work with elected tribal leaders on the ground. We do assessments, every few years about what their needs are, what they hope to kind of find or gain from our organization. And so, throughout that work, we've kind of compiled what some of these challenges are that they're dealing with and what they've faced. So, I think one of the most, interesting ones of these challenges that I heard was oftentimes your constituents have your personal cell phone number. They likely know where you work. They likely know you or your family just because the community is small. There are close kind of ties between folks. And so, as you could guess, it's really hard to get away from work. You might be working 24/7 with folks just kind of expecting you to be available to talk with them. You're also kind of expected to cover a big range of responsibilities, maybe something from meeting with state and local governments, all the way to making sure that someone's grandma has propane in the winter. You might be responsible for both of those things in one day, which are really different tasks. And that is not super typical with other elected officials. And as someone said in the Menti, interactions with sometimes hostile state and local governments, we especially see that in parts of rural Minnesota, the Dakotas, even more so. But, nations sometimes have to contend with these governments that might have a very anti-Native, racist approach to dealing with Native nations. One example is during COVID, one of our former staff members, his nation put up checkpoints on major highways. And those checkpoints were meant to kind of keep people safe, monitor who is coming and going, making sure that someone wasn't, just driving through, spreading COVID to folks in the community. And unfortunately, instead of kind of respecting the fact that the nation has sovereignty and the ability to set up those checkpoints, the governor of South Dakota tried to unlawfully shut those down. So that was something that the nation had to deal with. I would say that those tensions are very much still ongoing with that governor, but that is an example. Let's see. Also, another example is with a Native nation, a local utility. They wanted to replace some water lines that had asbestos in them throughout the city on this Native nation. And that's a great project because asbestos is super scary and you definitely don't want it in your water. But they kind of went about it in the wrong way. Instead of, approaching the nation and kind of working together with them on this and letting them know, they kind of just started doing the work without permission. And they dug into tribal lands. They started replacing the water infrastructure, meaning that they now had control of how the water flowed through the nation. And they kind of were encroaching on, tribally run systems, and eventually the nation had to pursue them in court. So, really, like what this boils down to is, if you're gonna try to do work on a native nation, definitely check in with that government first. And if you're gonna, reach out to a nation to propose a new partnership, sometimes might not hear back right away, and sometimes you just might not hear back at all. And that is probably likely due to the fact that it might just be a really busy time for those tribal leaders, or they might be dealing with something that's not on your radar. So we oftentimes have to be persistent and call folks and really understand the fact that they're dealing with all of this and so much more, and that our call might not be the most urgent thing that they're dealing with. So I will turn it over to Cree to kind of talk about how all this fits into like a bigger picture.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. And so I think you heard through that our tribal leaders are busy, our nations are really busy doing a lot of work to create a future that they want to see for their communities. And so, one thing that we do across our organization is really lean into the Native Nation rebuilding movement. And before we talk about what that is, what it looks like in action, we want to provide some context around why Native nations are working to rebuild in the first place. And so the root cause behind the need for rebuilding Native nations really stems from the impacts of ongoing colonization, but can be traced back to the institution of the Indian Reorganization Act, or IRA. And this was something that came about because in the 1930s, after decades of promoting these really harmful assimilation tactics and policies, the US government decided to take steps towards what they felt was restoring native self governments through passing the IRA. Among other provisions, the IRA did establish a framework for nations to draw up and ratify their own constitutions, which the federal government then recognized. So, while on its face, the IRA does sound like a positive change for Indian country, it actually resulted in the development of constitutions that were based on non native models, and because of that, the continued promotion of assimilation now through these tribal government systems. The IRA also ignored that many nations still had elders who remembered the traditional forms of governance that their nation would have been practicing, and that what would have been in place before the federal government attempted to erase them. And instead of allowing these nations to develop constitutions based around their culture and tradition, the IRA imposed this non native system that was modeled after colonial government structures and is kind of more similar to like a city council, checks and balances wise. So, this cookie cutter style of IRA constitution really left many native nations under extreme oversight of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and these nations' constitutions are still impacting them today. So it's within this context that many Native nations are working to rebuild their governments to better align with their culture, values, and their modern day needs. And Ho-Chunk Nation is an example of a Native nation who took the time to update their constitution with edits as recent as 2016. And during their constitutional reform, they decided to separate out their government into four different branches, those being a general council, legislative, executive, and judiciary. But as we've kind of covered so far, every Native nation and constitution is going to look a little bit different. And so we really envision this Native nation rebuilding movement leading to a future where Indigenous folks can thrive on their own terms. We see abundance, restoration, community building, brainstorming, and centering indigeneity, all as elements of this new future. And the movement itself is centered around five principles originally identified by researchers at Harvard. And they identified these principles by asking the question, why are some Native nations better able to thrive than others? And they really looked at it from an economic viewpoint, and they pinpointed these five principles that were helping Native nations thrive and succeed. And so we have a really short video to show you that will help you kind of get to know these principles a bit more in depth and a little bit more of an overview of that Native nation rebuilding movement itself. Let me get that going for y'all.
What is Native Nation rebuilding? Picture this: young people laughing as they play a game in their language, tribal leaders attending the grand opening of a new Indigenous wellness center, entrepreneurs hosting a pop-up event featuring Native-owned businesses. These all sound like hallmarks of a successful Native nation, right? Now, envision a different scenario. A tribal department head selecting his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. Elders not receiving the culturally specific health resources they need, a tribal council ousting their chairman due to allegations of theft. This nation sounds like it has some issues to resolve. You've likely heard real-life versions of many of these examples, and you've probably noticed that some Native nations are more successful than others. But have you ever stopped to truly consider why? This question inspired the researchers from the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, who originally created the Native Nation Rebuilding Framework. They analyzed a huge volume of data and case studies, eventually pinpointing 5 specific factors that lead to Native nations thriving on their own terms. The Rebuilding Framework provides guidance for both internal governance and external relationships through 5 interconnected principles. In order for Native nations to see results, the principles all need to exist at the same time. Let's explore the principles themselves and what they mean. Up first is transformational leadership. This means a nation's leaders serve as visionaries, changemakers, and mobilizers. Next is strong governing institutions. Essentially, this looks like a nation having systems, laws, and policies that are effective, clear, and fair. Nations with strong governing institutions also have mechanisms for adjusting systems that aren't working. We must consider the future, and that's where 7th generation thinking comes into play. This principle says that a nation's decision-making is strategic and long-term. Culture lies at the heart of who we are. The principle of cultural match is defined by the creation of systems that reflect Indigenous culture and values. And lastly, we can't forget about sovereignty, or a nation's ability to design and create its own future. You might be wondering, why is this framework referred to as rebuilding? The term rebuilding honors the fact that Native people and nations already have the tools they need to succeed. The rebuilding framework simply puts these tools into a common language. At its core, rebuilding is about using Indigenous knowledge and values to solve modern-day problems in a way that makes sense to that particular nation. One important note before we go: it's essential to differentiate between Native nation rebuilding approach and the standard approach. The standard approach refers to an unstrategic, unempowered, rushed, and oftentimes unfair way of solving problems. Think back to the example we gave earlier about the tribal department head who chose his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. This is a perfect example of the standard approach. Alternatively, using the Native nation rebuilding approach here would look like a nation developing a fair, transparent hiring process and ensuring that everyone in charge of hiring follows it. On the path to rebuilding, it's easy to default back to the standard approach because it feels known and comfortable. Changemakers working to implement Native nation rebuilding can draw upon their community's inherent strengths to overcome the standard approach and design a future that reflects Indigenous innovation and wisdom. To learn more about Native nation rebuilding and how to get started, visit nativegov.org.
All right. Apologies for any lagging that happened there, but that was just a bit more information about those Native Nation rebuilding principles. And as I said, that's something that we really take with us into all of our programming here at NGC. And it's important to recognize that these are really interconnected principles. So for a Native nation to succeed, it's not just one of these things. It really does take all of them working together. And that's where we're seeing the most success. Our organization also runs a leadership program, the Native Nation Rebuilders, I mentioned in the very beginning. And we equip changemakers with knowledge of these principles, among other skills and a lot of nation visits. But we have an alumni base of over 200 Native leaders now, with a new cohort joining each year. And so we like to share a few examples of how our cohorts have used this to contribute to the overall movement. And so our past cohort was cohort 12, aka the Deadly Dozen. And they have leaders who are working with youth through a mobile Indigenous Montessori classroom, providing culturally relevant youth programming over the summer for kids out of school, known as the Skoden series, a new economic and governance class being taught by a rebuilder at the White Earth Tribal and Community College, financial literacy and lending programs being developed, creating a youth council for their Native nation, covering tribal elections, and so much more. So our folks are really focused on their Native nations and communities, and how they can work on rebuilding and being a part of that process. And I'll turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk a bit more about Native Nation goals.
Yeah, thanks, Cree. So we've made it to our final content section, and then we will have time to kind of share some additional resources and get into those questions that you might have. But we just want to kind of talk about where Native nations are headed next. Like we've heard all this information about what they're currently doing, how they operate, but what are they hoping to achieve into the future? I guess I just really encourage everybody here to do some research. We're only able to feature a couple nations and their goals. Um, but it's just a really good idea to learn about the nations in your area and what they're hoping to do. Their websites are a really great place to start to kind of learn about what are their priorities, what are their projects that they're working on. Um, Many nations also deliver something called the State of the Band or the State of the Nation each year, really similar to the State of the Union or the State of the State addresses. I think actually Tim Walz just delivered that a couple days ago, yesterday, last week. It was very, very recent, and I can't recall how recent, but I know it happened. So nations have their own, and they share their goals during these talks. Actually, Ho Chunk Nation had theirs in February, and it was live streamed, but we couldn't find any recorded information to share at this time. But really kind of stay tuned and see if you can find any of those State of the Nation addresses out there. So I'm just going to touch on two nations in Minnesota Makoche and what they hope to achieve in kind of the near future and long-term future. The first one is Red Lake Nation. And this is something that's been in the news pretty recently, actually. One of their goals that they're really kind of leaning in toward tackling, it's been a goal for a long time, but I think momentum is really building with some legislative support, is reclaiming all of Upper Red Lake. And this situation is pretty just it's a wild story that it's hard to believe that this happened. It did. It's very unjust. But basically, they had their boundaries redrawn to exclude the eastern shore of Upper Red Lake without their consent. So they didn't know that this happened. They were, signing a treaty or signing an agreement. They signed something with kind of the boundaries sketched out. And when that agent who was, kind of doing that signing returned to Washington, they actually altered the map that was on that signed document, which kind of took out that part of the lake. So it drew this boundary, leaving kind of part of it outside of their hands. And it's been really tough because Red Lake has a lot of goals for conservation, for the entirety of the lake, um, that they're not really able to meet without that being in their control. So they're kind of in talks with the Department of the Interior about this, and they have some state legislators who have agreed to sponsor this legislation that really tries to kind of right this wrong that happened, in the past. And it's getting traction. People are talking about it. So really kind of stay up to date on that and see what they end up doing with that situation. They also have some cool sustainability projects that are in various stages of development, electric school buses, EV charging stations, solar gardens, putting solar panels on schools. So again, in that tribal government video, there was the phrase, governments are leading the way on innovation. Red Lake is in a super rural, remote area, but they're doing all of these cool energy projects. I just think that that's so innovative and great. And they're also doing some work in the Twin Cities on their tribal college, creating a new home for that across from US Bank Stadium. So again, you'll probably see mention of this more so now that you've heard about it, but kind of just stay tuned to see what Red Lake is up to. The other nation we want to highlight is a nation that, as an organization, we're really close to. They have a really awesome tribal president who has kind of participated in a lot of our programming. So we are going to actually provide a clip of him speaking with our former executive director. We created this really fun YouTube series a couple years ago, and the goal of it is we're putting an Indigenous twist on the YouTube series called Hot Ones, which is, it's based around the host sits down with celebrities and they kind of do an interview, but the fun part is they're eating hotter and hotter wings throughout the interview, and it definitely gets a little bit hard for, both people to focus on what's going on. So we thought that was really great. We put our own spin on it, and so we have, the Lower Sioux president here with our host. If you are curious about this series, we have more of it on YouTube. We've had the United States Treasurer, we've had Dallas Goldtooth from Reservation Dogs on Hulu. Definitely check it out. But we will look at this clip and hear a little bit about some of the goals that Lower Sioux has for their community. And it looks like we have to scroll to the appropriate. I wish we could show the whole thing, but we'll just take a second here to do that.
I wonder, to kind of bring everything back around, what's the biggest opportunity you all have?
I think our biggest opportunity right now is the hemp that we're getting into. We're going to be building houses out of hempcrete. The more I'm learning about it, it's a no-brainer. I mean, these homes get better over time instead of dilapidated and need to be fixed. So all those health benefits, the fire, the pest, the carbon sequestering, it's something that I'm looking forward to, because we did get a grant through deed recently, $1.5 million towards it. We've been growing it for 3 years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
We've got bales, so we're just waiting to get that equipment set up and get them going.
Right on. And then last, to kind of wrap us up, what's your vision for the future of Lower Sioux?
Vision for my vision? I would love it if we could make it so that each of our members doesn't need to come and ask for anything.
Well, President Larson, thanks for joining us today. Thank you.
All right. And as you might have noticed, both of them touched their eyes at different points after eating that hot sauce. So that was a little bit concerning for us, but they both made it through. But that was just a really cool clip about how Lower Sioux Indian community is really kind of piloting this new technology of building homes out of hempcrete, which, I think is kind of the combination of hemp and concrete, but it's this cool new building material that's really sustainable, energy efficient, and they have a housing shortage on their nation. They just don't have enough housing for everyone who wants to live in their nation. And so they're working to build this as quickly as possible in a sustainable way, so it will last into the future. And if you've looked at building costs these days, you'll know that like any sort of innovation that can be brought to the process is really welcomed. So that was just a really cool, initiative that they were talking about at the time. I think since this video has been released, they've actually built a couple demonstration homes out of hempcrete. So if you're ever in the area, that is something that is cool that's happening near Lower Sioux. But, we're going to kind of leave it there. We've heard about a lot that nations are doing. So to close it out, we just wanted to know, is there something that stood out to you most from what you've heard from the nations? Maybe something that was really new for you, maybe something that felt very innovative, maybe something that you had a question about or you didn't understand. Let's just kind of see where people are at, and then we'll share some additional resources to keep learning. And thank you for everybody who is still here with us. It can be a lot on a weeknight, but we just really appreciate the enthusiasm for this content. And also not sure is still a good answer. That's okay too. It's a lot to process. Okay. Positive and empowering movement. Yes. I think it's just really cool to like situate this in something bigger and kind of show how people are working together and what the goals are. Um, each nation is really diverse. Yes. The rebuilding effort. I know. I learned about that, when I started at NGC and just thought like this is such a cool way of talking about everything happening. Yep, land and environmental strategies, 100%. There are just so many things happening. Um, it's hard to even keep track. Well, thank you, everybody. Those were super meaningful, observant answers. Really appreciate, everybody kind of staying with us here. We're just gonna put up a quick QR code actually. And if you don't like QR codes or you thought QR codes were dead, same, but they're back. You can go to our website and click on resources instead, if that's how you'd like to access this. But basically the point is we have so much more than just this content that you can access at any time. We have videos, we have guides. All of this information is free and available to anybody who wants to learn on a variety of topics. Some are really broad, kind of like what language do I use to talk about Native nations? Some are very detailed. We have a guide on blood quantum. How does it work? What is it? Why do nations use that, or some of them use that? Just encourage you to check this out. Cree and I are also available at any time if you have questions about our resources, but we just create them so people can keep learning because I'm guessing, you have questions and want to keep digging into this. So maybe we'll just go right into questions. We were going to ask, what do you plan after doing this, after learning this information today? But if anybody wants to kind of share that during the Q&A, that's great too. So we will kind of open it up. You can raise your hand, you can unmute, you can put something in the chat. And even if you don't have a question and you just want to share a key takeaway or something that resonated with you, that's great too. Cree, do you have anything to add or anything you want to say before we open it up?
No, I think just for those of you looking to further your education, those free resources are great. Rebuilding Native Nations is a book for those of you who are academic or want to check that out. And we are huge research lovers. So if you need additional books or things recommended, maybe that's part of your question, and we're happy to share about that.
We're
And
gonna
I
give it
think,
a couple minutes. I was just
oh,
gonna say, it's so valuable to have this time. I mean, if you're
yep.
not gonna ask a question now, when are you gonna ask it? So we'll just
Mhm.
kind of let it simmer for a bit. Cree, what were you gonna say? Sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. I was gonna say, not to maybe steal anyone's question if they were thinking of this, but a common one that comes up that we kind of touched on in the presentation is like, where do you get started with this learning? And a lot of it is really just finding the Native nations closest to you and your community and starting that research, whether it's on the nation's website, by attending events they host that are open to the public. There are a lot of different touch points depending on the community that you can kind of look out for. So that's just one that we like to share more generally.
Okay. Um, all right. So we have a question from Jim. I'm just gonna try to read it and then try to word it. I don't know, Jim, if you want to explain or if you just want me to read from the chat. Um, let's see. Okay. So it makes you feel awkward because you are living on stolen land. How do Native people feel about the situation? Well, I think one, the group is not a monolith. So I think so many people have so many different opinions. That would be the preface. But I think, for me, I use kind of that stolen land framework because even though it's not a recent situation, it did happen and it was taken, even though treaties were signed, a lot of them were under very suspicious and terrible circumstances where it was much more of a forced signing rather than like an agreement that actually was made under good terms. So I think for me, it's kind of recognizing what happened and kind of getting people thinking about the need to continue to work toward justice and to work toward helping nations thrive. Cree, do you have anything you want to add there?
I think that was a really beautiful example. I think the only thing I would add to your answer to that question is something that I have been thinking about a lot and has come up in our work more and more is this idea that we are all treaty people, native or non-native. To Lauren's point, all of us are typically living on treaty land. So really thinking about what that means, because as Lauren pointed out, unfortunately, these were oftentimes not agreements made in good faith or in the best of conditions. And so really sitting with that information, although it is uncomfortable, but recognizing the benefits of that too. As a treaty person, you have all the benefits of that treaty being signed. And so I think there are a lot of different perspectives, as Lauren said. But many of us in the Native community will use that term like stolen land, or you might also hear the phrase like you are on native land. There's a lot of different ways it gets talked about, but I think it's important to remember that we're all part of that treaty process.
Thanks, Jim. We appreciate, just being the first person to be bold and put a question out there. It's always appreciated. Anybody else? We have a little bit less than 10 minutes here left. Even if it's something that maybe is related to some of our other resources or something we touched upon briefly, that's totally open for questions too. Or if Elsa has anything, to kind of interject with a question or a thought, we're open as well.
I will ask, I know you work mostly with governments. Have you ever done any educational work, like with education systems or um, native school programs? Because that's something that a lot of our community members in White Bear Lake are interested in is the kids' education process.
Yeah, so we have done some work on educating educators on, kind of how they can better educate in the classroom. We are actually presenting at the Minnesota Indian Education Conference in a couple weeks. Our session is really kind of geared toward how can educators best support Native students in the classroom without overburdening maybe kind of the one person at the school who has been tasked with kind of supporting Native students, but we try to really make our resources available to educators as much as we can. We get a lot of requests from them. And we also had a special project of our organization called We Are Still Here, Minnesota, and Cree actually just shared that. And there's been some really cool guides that have come out of that, plus like the Understand Native Minnesota campaign geared toward educators. So I would say check that out. That was a project of the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community that's unfortunately wrapping up, but there's so much great work that came out of it. Cree, what do you think? Any educator focused info that you want to add?
Yeah, I think Minnesota is unique because there is the Indigenous Education for All mandate. So I think in addition to just a lot of natural interest around this topic from educators, there's now the added maybe push for some to get more interested in it. And I think there are a lot of great guides, as Lauren said. And I would also really encourage educators and anyone really to look out for like in-person land-based experiences. In the cities, there's a great one called Beyond Badote, where you can go to a site and really learn more about the historical stories of the site and what took place there, but also what's happening currently and kind of how that connects with Native nations today. And I really just encourage educators and anyone to look for opportunities like that where you are out on the land, learning from a community member, getting those stories in person can be really, really beneficial and very helpful for me as an individual too, learning about another Native nation.
Awesome. Well, Elsa, your question spurred some great questions. We have two new ones that came in. So I think we'll tackle both of those before we close out, hopefully. But I will start with Joy, since they haven't asked a question yet. Do you know if there's somewhere current homeowners can research the original tribal owners of the land we live on? For me, that's south of White Bear Lake. Do any tribes keep their own records of lands they used to own? That is a great question. I would say, the best place to start is kind of like a really general search. There's actually a tool we can put in the chat here. It is a map from Native Land Digital, and you can simply plug in where you live and then get some information out of that. I will say that it's definitely kind of a starting point because the information generated is kind of an aggregate of so many different sources. And so from there, I think you can actually kind of connect to existing Native nations, learn more about them. I'm guessing, based on where you say that you live, Dakota communities are going to be kind of the ones who are the stewards of that land. Cree, do you have any kind of additions that you want to chime in with on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of like general starting point. And then once you have an idea of maybe the specific modern day nation that land connects to, typically we do have different like land or I can't think of the term, I'm so sorry. But we will have like a specific office for that within our native nations. So yeah, that's typically like a record that if maybe the county or city doesn't have access to, you can approach that native nation and maybe it's a record that they have kept. But it will really vary depending on the native nation for like what that access looks like, what those records look like. Um, and just in general, there are some really cool Native organizations popping up, like the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, that wants to help folks do those land back services or activities. And so that's a great resource you can connect with as well if you just want to learn about success stories from folks who've gone through it or like get help doing that research as well.
Yeah, that's so great. I just added another organization. There's so many that are really trying to illuminate the history of places we might all be familiar with in the area. The Wakan Tipi Center is also being constructed, I believe, as we speak, which is near what folks might know as the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. And I think folks in those organizations have kind of this deep understanding too of Dakota communities and the history there. So recommend reaching out. And then finally, Jim is asking if members of Native communities are essentially dual citizens of state and national systems as well. Are there implied rights and responsibilities that extend beyond those explicitly established by treaty? Cree, do you want to tackle that one first, and then I will jump in?
Absolutely. And so your initial question there, Jim, you are absolutely on the right track. We are essentially dual citizens. So I myself am a citizen of the Chippewa Cree tribe, but I'm also a citizen of the state of Arizona and the United States more broadly. And so every Native nation will be a little bit different. And so there are absolutely treaty rights that I have access to as a citizen of that nation. So, for example, because my nation is along the border of Canada, similar to many other Native nations that share the border, we have something called the Jade Treaty. And that is where, as long as we have our tribal ID, we can go back and forth over the border. You don't need a passport necessarily. So that would be like a specific treaty right that I have access to as a citizen of that nation. That's not the same for all Native nations. And then I think more generally, when you're asking about maybe rights and responsibilities beyond those in the treaty, that's where it's really going to go back to the Native nations' cultural and traditional values. A huge saying among my people is love one another and help one another. So while that's not like built into our treaty, a lot of us look into those service roles or look into how we can be of service to community members, whether that's our urban Native community, our specific Native nation. There, it can look very different, but I would say you're absolutely on the right track. It is just going to look very different depending on the citizen or the Native nation that you're looking at. And I know we're right at time, but Lauren, if you have anything to add.
No, that was great. I think one other example from our presentation today is tribal elections. And, even though a treaty may not talk about those elections, as a citizen, you have that right and responsibility to participate and kind of represent your nation and help move that forward. So that's just, something else you can draw back to from our content. But Cree, I'll pass it back over to you to close this out.
Yeah, so we just like to say a big miigwech. Thank you so much. We appreciate being able to just kind of share information, hopefully spark some different ideas and like engagement for where you're at in your learning journey. And we really encourage you all to continue gathering information after today. As we referenced, we have a bunch of free guides and resources, lots of other ways to connect with us in the future and remain engaged. And also really encourage you to attend some of the future White Bear offerings. It sounds like there's going to be some really cool Native presenters and folks that you can learn from. But we just want to say thank you so much for having us here. We really appreciate your engagement tonight. I know it's hard on a Thursday evening when it was kind of nice weather today. So we just appreciate all of your intention and engagement, and we hope you keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you both very much for your time and effort here on this presentation. We really appreciate it. Again, if anybody else has any questions that you think of later, you're more than welcome to reach out directly to them, or you can go through me and the White Bear Historical Society, and we can get you in contact too as well.